Hi, my name is Bob Foster. Obviously, the little harp that I was playing just a moment ago is too small for me. Most of the time, I really enjoy playing this harp, built by a professional harp builder or harper named Tat Stanley, who lives in Kingston, Ontario. It's just a beautiful instrument. But I have become interested in how harps are made, and this is actually the fifth one that I've designed myself and made. And the reason it's so small is it's going to be a birthday gift for a very young person. And that young person is our youngest granddaughter, Georgia Foster, also known by her nickname Gia. Gia is just going to be 1 year old soon. But I decided to build her a harp. Now, why would you do that for a 1-year-old? Well, looking back, I can say that the greatest gift my father ever gave me was the gift of music. And I know he received the gift of music from his father as well. And it's my intention to pass that gift along to as many members of our family as I can. And so Gia will have this around. There are little pointy bits on harps, so it might not be the best thing for her to do anything except supervise strumming right at this point. But it will be there if she ever decides that she wants to play with it and get a bit of enjoyment from music herself. So the rest of this video is actually going to be the process that I used in building this harp, and it's the principles that are involved are applicable to larger harps as well. So the video is really provided for people who are interested in getting into making a harp, and recognizing that I am a rank amateur at this, I would invite any people who are experienced harp builders to go ahead and make comments in the section below, because you may have some ideas that that we can all learn from, including me. So let's head off on the rather interesting journey about how to design and build a little harp like this, or a larger harp if you wish to, from scratch. The one thing we know about the harp at the very beginning is that the strings will be in a straight line. So that's where we start the planning, with one line to represent one string. The soundboard, which is the part of the harp at the bottom of the strings, is at an angle to those strings. So we can represent the top of the soundboard with another line at an angle to the strings. Now in this case I've chosen an angle of 38 degrees. Variations on this angle are fine, but I know this one will result in a nicely proportioned harp. Then we extend the line for the top of the soundboard, and each bottom of the vibrating section of the string is going to be right at this line on the top of the soundboard. Next, we need to ensure that all the strings are spaced at an equal distance from each other. This needs to be far enough apart so the fingers can reach in between the strings as they are plucked, but not so far apart that it's difficult to reach other strings with your hand as you're doing a chord. My preference is for a distance between strings of about 15 millimeters, but you will find harps that have varying distances between strings, usually in the range of about 13 to 17 millimeters. So to space them, first we're going to use a set square to draw a line at 90 degrees to the string line. We can then set out our marked desired spacing on this line and repeat the measurements until you have enough marks for all the strings in your planned harp. In this case, it's the first harp made for a child, so I'm only going to use 15 strings. Then use your set square further up on the plan to draw another line at 90 degrees from the string line. And you make the marks for each string, again at exactly the same spacing. Now we're going to use a longer meter stick to connect the dots. And we know the bottom of each vibrating string will be right at the soundboard, but now we need to figure out where the top of the vibrating area of the string should be. And that's where a string chart becomes necessary. Now you can find string charts for commercially made harps at the same place where you buy your set of strings for them. And I'm going to provide a link to Music Makers under this video. They do an especially good job of providing strings and the hardware you may need for your harp. And this string chart that we're going to use is for one of their harps. A copy of the string chart will also come when you order strings that you're going to purchase. And yes, you do need to use harp strings. They're already marked for you, so the red ones are all the note C. The F's are in blue or black, and the others are clear. And as you go on with playing the harp, it will be necessary to know where those markings are so that you can play effectively. It's not good enough to have all of your strings the same color. So looking at this chart, you can see the vibrating length for the highest string is only 4 inches. Now this is going to be the distance between the soundboard and a bridge pin, which is a device we're going to use to hold the top of the string in position and ensure both the correct spacing of the strings and their proper alignments. So for the first string, let's go back to the plan. We'll measure the line up from the soundboard for a distance of 4 inches and mark that point. Now you go back and forth to the string chart, and for each new string you check the length, measure that length up the string, and make a little mark. So each time you draw the length for a new string, starting at the soundboard, you're going to make a mark further up the string line to show the length, and soon a pattern is going to emerge. The pattern looks like the curve that first goes downwards towards the soundboard and then starts to climb up again. And if this was a harp with more strings, you would see that the curve has a very distinctive pattern, the one that we associate with the shape of the neck of a harp. While the distance between the strings is critical for a harp that's easy to play, the specific length of the vibrating string can be changed a little bit without any ill effects. You see, the note played by a string is dependent on 3 things: the string's length, its thickness or weight, and the tension that is put on the string. So we can still have strings perfectly in tune if we adjust the length a little bit simply by tightening or loosening the string a bit more or a bit less. For this reason, I like to smooth out the position of the bridge pins to make their placement look a little like a nicer curve. So you can see the very small changes that I've made in this picture. Now, lever harps often have 3 types of hardware on the neck. The bridge pins are used to set the top part of the string that will vibrate. Above them, the tuning pins allow us to change the pitch of the string by tightening or loosening it. And on more advanced harps, you're also going to find sharping levers. When they are engaged, usually by moving the lever up, they raise the note played by the string by exactly 1/2 semitone. And harpists can set these in different configurations so they can play the instrument in different keys without having to retune any of the strings. Now I'm mentioning this here because if you plan to use sharpening levers, you will need to leave room for them on your plan on the width of the neck. You also need to have a little room both above the tuning pins and below the sharpening levers to ensure that the wood can hold them firmly. This can result, if you're using sharpening levers, in a very wide neck, especially if the harp has strings that are lower in pitch. But in the case of the child's harp I am planning here, it's easier to keep things simple and the design as light and attractive as possible. So I don't plan to use any sharpening levers, and this means that I only need to provide room for the bridge pins and the tuning pins and a little bit of wood on each side to make sure the pins stay firmly in place. While the strings on the top of the soundboard can be straight lines, you can employ whatever you have at hand to make a pleasing shape for the neck of the harp and the pillar. My planning table is near the kitchen, so various pieces of kitchen articles can come into play. And for longer arcs on parts of large circles, I attach a string to something nearby, put a loop in it, and then adjust the position under a pen, which is retracted so it's not making any marks, until I get the position just right, and then I set the pen and make the lines on the plan. At this stage of planning, I also allow things to get a bit messy as I move lines and make adjustments to make sure that the harp is both functionally practical and visually appealing. In this plan, you can see that I was trying to decide whether to make the bass at an angle that would normally be used for placing the harp on the lap of someone as the instrument is played. That would look like bass A. Or if I should make the bass so that the harp could stand on its own on display with the weight above it more evenly distributed. And I decided that would be the more practical way to go. So this harp will be made with the angle for the bass that is shown as bass B. Once the plan is fully developed the way you wish, it's time to get out the scissors and turn it into a template by cutting it out. And then it's finally time to head to the workshop. I begin by marking out the outline of the template for the neck section and the pillar section on pieces of the material I plan to use. There's a fair bit of tension and torsion and twisting on the neck of a harp, so it will stay stronger and last longer if those parts are made of 3 layers of wood that are laminated together, with the center section having the grain at right angles to the outer pieces. In each case, I will have prepared the wood by planing it down to a 1/2 inch width on a thickness planer, so the 3 layers will be laminated together to make a width of 1.5 inches, which is a good width for a neck on most harps. If you don't have a thickness planer, you may find that some local lumber yards are willing to plane the wood down for you for a fee. So I start by roughly cutting out around the template, maybe leaving about a 1/2 inch outside the template mark on the outer pieces. What we need to start will be 2 outer pieces for the neck, 2 for the pillar. At the same time, I cut 2 sides for the sound box. The picture shows them in rough form with, again, about a 1/2 inch left outside the template outlines. In this case, I'm making the outside layers out of black walnut and the inside core out of ash. So the small pieces of ash are cut and then placed with the grain at right angles to the grain of the outer pieces. Hardwoods are required because of the stress on the bridge pins and tuning pins over time, and if you use softwoods, they would eventually come loose. Other hardwoods that are commonly used to make harps would include cherry and maple, bubinga, and other exotic woods. Okay, and now it's time to make sandwiches. We take the pieces, clamp them together so that we have 3 layers each on the neck and the pillar, and leave them to dry for 24 hours. When I'm gluing pieces of wood together, I use a contractor grade wood glue. It seems to work well. When the pieces are solidly laminated, it's time to cut them down to the template outline size. And it might be possible to do that with a jigsaw, but a bandsaw, if you have one available, does a really nice job. The sides of the neck and pillar then need to be sanded smooth, and I use a special inverted belt sander for that purpose. It is available on Amazon, and perhaps I could link to that belt sander, because I know I spent years trying to use a regular belt sander upside down, and it didn't work very well. This one is made to be inverted so that the sanding is on the top surface, and that's easier for the work you're going to do. I also prefer to do this work outside because you can produce a lot of sawdust, and a mask and eye protection are essential because in some cases, as it is with black walnut, the sawdust can actually be a carcinogen if it's inhaled. But it's only the sawdust that causes this problem, so the solid black walnut, especially when it's covered with a polyurethane finish, presents no danger, and it will be no danger to my grandchild using the harp. The belt sander does a very nice job on the edges. I prefer to leave the pillar just a little bit long at the bottom, so there's going to be room to adjust it when fitting it to the base of the sound box. But the top of the pillar needs to be cut. The underside of the neck where it joins the pillar needs to be a nice clean straight cut as well. There are several ways to join the neck to the pillar, and they're discussed in building instructions that are available on the Sligo Harp website. So I'll leave a link to that in the list below, or the description below this video. In this case, though, the easiest way is to use dowels, and they'll be more than adequate for joining the pieces. Often the sides of the sound box are set under the top piece and held in place with screws. For a large harp, this is a better choice structurally, since the pressure of the sound box under the tension of the strings is upwards. But in this case, we're using very light strings on this harp. They're all very high strings, so they're quite thin. So I decided to improve the overall appearance of the harp by allowing the soundboard sides to come up and overlap the top piece. Small pieces of hardwood were later cut to the right angles and placed in each corner so that there would be more surface to glue and a stronger glue joint. The outside edges of the top piece have to be mitered, and in this case I chose 5 degrees, so you have to miter them so you have an outward slope, because the top of the soundboard is thinner, less wide than the bottom of the soundboard. When you set the angle at the top of the sound box, it's important to make sure each side is attached at the same degree of slope. It's easy to get things twisted a little bit and have one side going out at a slope wider than the other, and that's not going to work for you as the rest of the playing on the harp proceeds. Things will be out of alignment. So in this case, the bottom of the sound box is going to be attached to a thicker base, so the bottom of the sound box I'm preparing only had to be 1/2 inch thick, because a more solid piece will be set to it later on. But again, even the bottom part needs to be mitered to a 5 degrees outward slope so that the sides of the sound box will come down and meet properly. You also should miter the front and the back edges of the bottom piece of the sound box to make it fit with the slope that you're using for the sound box. I should mention here that the sides of the sound box typically are wider at the bottom of the end than the top. This is because the high notes need less space to resonate in, and the low notes need a larger space. Think of the difference between the sound produced by a small ukulele and the sound produced by a large guitar. The large guitar has a larger soundboard, so it has a deeper sound overall. In this particular case, though, the notes are all going to be high, and so I don't need to worry about making the overall sound box thinner at the top and wider at the bottom, and I do have a couple of nice pieces of ash I want to use on it, so they'll work perfectly well. The soundboard is under tension from the strings, and the sides of the sound box are only 1/2 inch thick, so that doesn't give you much room to make a strong attachment with glue. So what I do is I make softwood liners to attach to the sides and the top and bottom, both on the front and back of the sound box. This means that there will be more of a surface to glue the sound board to when it's time to do so. So while all of that is drying, I had time to make the base, and I decided I wanted to make something a little bit fancier than a simple rectangle. So I outlined a square on a piece of almost 1 inch, 15/16 walnut, and then I went to the square and cut out the corners using a drill bit called a Forstner bit. This one was 1 3/4 inches wide. And when the lines for the square are cut out after that, it produces a more interesting outline that you can see here. And then I just cut the edges and shaped them using a handheld router. I also used the router with a roundover bit to round the edges of the assembled neck and pillar at this time. We can see the effect of that roundover bit in shaping the neck and pillar in a moment, but first I had to tape the template back onto the neck. It's time to mark out the positions for those bridge pins very precisely, and also the tuning pins, perhaps a little less precisely. And all tapped with a hammer sets a nice little guide hole. I ordered my bridge pins from music makers, and they came both with the drill bit size for them and an Allen key for adjusting them. Perhaps it was a bit of additional cost, but it's a nice way to set things together. I ran a test drill into walnut and inserted and removed a bridge pin just to make sure that the bridge pins were going to seat solidly. There is a difference even in hardwoods with the degree to which the wood will hold something tightly. So I'd recommend that you do test drills in whatever material you're using. The roundover bit on the handheld router worked fine for shaping the neck and pillar, and here I'm starting to drill the holes for the zither pins, and yes, I definitely did a test drill and placement in walnut before drilling those holes as well. Harp spends years under tension, and it's not a matter, they say, of if they will break, but just when. And the job of the harp maker is to delay the breaking as long as possible. So if you want a harp that's going to last for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, then it might be a good idea to make sure that it's repairable. And I like to make my harps as repairable as possible. So I attach the neck to the top of the sound box with screws that can be removed. But I don't attach the foot of the pillar to the base at all. It's just left as a loose joint with no glue or anything in it to be removed later on. Instead, to hold it in place, I cut a little shoe for it, a shoe that would fit around it, and fit and glue that to the bottom of the base. Now, the reason I don't need to join these two things together is because when the strings are on the harp, the pressure on the base pulled by the strings is all upwards. So all that's required to tighten the base to the pillar is the strength of the strings that are tensioned. And if and when something does fail in the future, it should be easy enough to remove the back, undo the screws for the neck, and then the whole neck and pillar will come off the sound box for a repair. For this harp, I chose to make the soundboard out of the best material available, and that would be Sitka spruce. Sitka, S-I-T-K-A, spruce, which comes from old-growth forests. Now, before you or my friends go into shock about my perceived damage to the environment, I will hasten to add the following. This wood was salvaged from generations-old buildings in Alaska, where the Sitka spruce had been used as beams in buildings for construction. And there is a company that now gathers this and reclaims the wood from those beams and then does specialty cutting to it to prepare it solely for use in high-end acoustic guitars and harp soundboards. The benefits to the harp builder are obvious. There's no further damage to the environment or the trees, and the wood has already been matured through decades, so its sound quality is superior to anything else that could be cut more recently. I'll leave a link to that company's website in case anyone is interested in acquiring environmentally friendly Sitka spruce for soundboards either on a harp or guitar. If I had a joiner, this would definitely be the time to use it, but I don't. So a flat piece of sandpaper was used to square and smooth the edges to be joined. I also did fine sanding on the surface that goes on the inside of the sound box, because I will have to attach a thing called a string rib on the inside to it at a later step, and I wanted the glue joint to be as firm as possible. Now, in preparation for gluing the soundboard top to the sound box, all the surfaces on the top edge of the sound box have to be sanded and leveled so that we'll have a good glue joint and no seams or gaps. In this particular case, I found it easier to set and glue the top board of the soundboard first because I wanted to round the top edge over the top board inside the sound box, just to keep it looking even with the sides which had been rounded in the same way. And so I did that and let it dry, and then I glued the lower soundboards. Now, the bottom piece of the soundboard has to have a slot cut in it to accommodate the area that goes around the part of the pillar that goes to the base of the soundboard. So you check that and mark it until you can create a hole that's just about the right size. Do a final check for placement. And I don't know if you can see it in this picture, but there are two very long, thin triangles that I've cut out of walnut. And they are placed at the bottom of the soundboard material that I'm trying to glue. And as you push the triangles together, they increase the tension on the soundboard and create a nice longitudinal pressure so that the pieces of spruce, the edges of the pieces of the spruce are pushed together. And then you don't want it to pop up, so you also put clamps on the top and bottom to make sure there's a good glue joint between the soundboard and the sound box. I also use softwood shims underneath the clamps to avoid any damage to the surface of the soundboard. Now, the soundboard needs to be thinner at the top and a bit thicker at the bottom. So I arranged for most of that work to be done ahead of time as I planed the very top piece down to a thickness of 5/32 of an inch, and then each successive piece I made 1/32 of an inch thicker than that. This left some differences in levels that you can see in this picture, and those differences in levels needed to be removed with further sanding. So the belt sander that I showed you earlier was used to remove the overhang of the edges of the spruce, and then the top was sanded down to be smooth and straight. Then I shaped and created a foot piece to go underneath the last piece of spruce and to trim the area that's going to be right underneath the joint of the pillar to the bottom of the sound box. Now the next piece to be prepared was the outer string rib. This is a piece of thin hardwood that goes on the top of the soundboard to accommodate the little brass eyelets that the strings go through. You don't want to have your strings run straight through wood, or the tension of the strings will pull against the grain of the wood and break it eventually. So we use brass eyelets, and you don't. I should say some harp makers that know their craft well enough just put the eyelets right into the soundboard. I'm less prepared to do that because it's possible that the eyelets themselves could cause damage to the soundboard unless you really know what you're doing. And so I prefer to have an outer string rib made of hardwood, which is not likely to split from the pressure on the eyelets. There's also a string rib on the inside of the harp, on the lower surface of the soundboard, and that's used to prevent the strings from ripping through the soundboard material and popping out. So in this case, I used something different. I used a laminated finished birch plywood for the inner string rib. It's a very tough material, so strong in fact that one of its primary uses is as the outside covering for home-built aircraft. It has 6 layers of wood set in cross-grain patterns in a thickness of only 1/8 of an inch. That's quite remarkable. I didn't have any clamps that would be suitable for holding the inner string rib in place, so this is a MacGyver moment, and I just found a few weighty items and put them inside, and that worked just fine. I'm including this picture as a reminder that the step and harp construction that probably takes longer than anything else is sanding. Lots and lots and lots of sanding. So I drilled holes in the birch plywood to test for the drill size, and then drilled holes in the outer string rib and supported the soundboard underneath as I tapped the eyelets into place. It's important to do that. You don't want to weaken the soundboard by hitting and giving the direct pressure of a hammer blow onto the soundboard itself. So you have to have something underneath to support the string ribs as you insert those eyelets. Now at this stage, this is the exciting part. The harp starts to come together. The harp is placed on its side with the pillar and the neck elevated correctly to make a right angle joint. And then the holes are drilled through the top of the sound box into the neck joint, and it is secured with screws. The base of the sound box is also secured to the base that I'm going to use for the harp in the same way with screws, so that if necessary and the sound box has to be repaired or replaced at some point, it's all screw joints and the sound box can be completely removed from the base and the neck and the pillar. Now, since all the string tension is on one side of the neck, it has a tendency to twist over time, and to counteract that, neck blocks are placed with a larger one in this case being joined to the neck with screws, and it's the one on the side to prevent the neck from twisting over towards the string side, and that's attached with screws, and then the smaller one is put on the other side just to cover the screw holes. The back cover for the sound box doesn't need to be of acoustic material. It's not going to vibrate the same way the soundboard is. It's more just a cover, but it does need to have holes in it. Both that holes allow the sound to come out, and it's also for accessing the string rib underneath, where you have to insert the strings as they're changed. Now, in this case, the family had 5 members, so I cut out 5 hearts into the cover, and I also made the cover out of finished birch plywood. The body of the harp is now built, and it was time for several coats of polyurethane. In each case, I would sand with a very fine grit sandpaper before the next coat. That should be no heavier than 220, and probably up to about 400 would be better. And I know it doesn't feel right if you haven't done much work with woodworking before. Yeah, the first time you put on a nice coat of urethane, it looks lovely, and you think, oh, I'm going to go rough it all up with sandpaper. I know it, but it's absolutely necessary in order to get the coat that you want in the end. Now it's time to put the hardware in place, and so the bridge pins go in first. Again, their placement is crucial, but the template you use should assure you that all marks were made through the template into just the right place to put the holes. Still, if you're using a drill to put the pins in place, you should do so slowly to avoid burning out the wood or reaming out the hole if you're using the drill too quickly. Here's a picture from the building of a larger harp that I was making, but you can see that an easy way to make sure the bridge pins are all aligned is just to use a block of wood cut to a desired thickness and hold it up to them as a measure. That advice that I just gave about using the drill to place the bridge pins and keeping the speed low would also apply to the zither tuning pins that are being used on this harp as well. Well, there you go. It's finally time to install the strings and make some music. To determine what material to use for each string, or what thickness of string, you need to go back to the string chart you used during the planning phase. Quite often when the material for the strings is sent to you, it's a long piece of monofilament line, and you just cut out a piece that's going to be the right length for making your knot and tying around the tuning pin at the top and the vibrating string length, and keep the rest of it. It's nice to have extra strings available in case one snaps in the future. So with thicker strings, usually they have some device on the end of the string that will hold them and keep them from going through the inner string rib, or the hole in the inner string rib. And for medium thickness strings, there is a thing called a harp knot. I'll leave you to research that one on YouTube, because there are lots of good videos showing how to make a harp knot. But it's essentially a knot that sets the end of the string at a right angle to the length of the string, so it's harder for it to pull through the hole. But for very light strings like the ones on this harp, it's better to secure them under the soundboard with a short piece of doweling. So I cut several pieces of doweling and then deburred them with sandpaper. Now, you can also check YouTube for videos about tying strings to doweling, but basically it goes like this. You go around the piece of doweling and make a granny knot around the dial and pull it tight. But you make sure you leave a little bit of the end of the string out, and it should eventually it will lay right along the length of the dowling. Then you make another loop in the string, give it a twist, and put it around over top of that short piece of the end of the string, and you pull it tight, and the knot holds firmly, and it should look like this. So after you've made the knot, feed the other end of the string up through the hole in the string rib, through the eyelet, and all the way up to the tuning pin. And then you should probably cut the string with about 2 inches to spare past the tuning pin. Now it's very important when you first put a small piece of the string, the end of the string, through the hole in the tuning pin, leave a little bit extra hanging out, perhaps a ½ inch or so. And then the first loop that you make of the string has to go around the tuning pin on the outside. That's towards where you're going to put the tuning hammer on the string, so the outside, away from the harp. Then the second loop, right after that, has to cross where this end of the string is coming out and go on the inside of where that hole is. So what happens is that the loops on either side of that end piece of the string will put pressure on the end of the string and keep it from simply slipping back out of the hole and coming loose. Now the strings will need to be tuned a lot, especially nylon strings. They take quite a while to stay in tune, so you need to tune it several times a day at first, and then I would say probably once or twice a day for a week, and then even up to 2 weeks you will still find it going slightly out of tune at times. So you need to keep tuning it for about 2 weeks. That's perfectly normal for nylon strings. Also, one tip here that I should pass along is that if you're using a guitar tuner attached to some of the tuning pins to tune your strings, you can do that all the way up to about 2 octaves above middle C. Your guitar tuner will show the notes accurately there. This particular harp actually starts, let's see, two octaves above middle C and goes to the last C is 4 octaves above middle C, basically about the last note on the piano, I think. And that top octave cannot be tuned with a guitar tuner. The equipment simply doesn't read it accurately. So what you should probably do is tune the first octave, the lower octave, and then by ear tune the top octave. This is a normal thing, by the way. Even the person who tuned our piano for us told me that it's impossible to use a tuner on the very, very high notes. Well, that's it. If you've done all these steps, you have just finished a child's harp, or perhaps you've used the steps to make something else. Again, I'd like to remind you that I'm very much still a novice harp maker, and I do invite any experienced harp makers who might happen to see this video to comment, please, and share your advice in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. I hope this video might prove helpful to someone else who is interested in the fun hobby of making these beautiful instruments.